Hey guys, this is Anand Karthick, and today's video is about Linux. Linux is basically a kernel. Some of you might be wondering what a kernel is. A kernel is the bridge between hardware and software, and kernel is the central and most basic part of an operating system or else OS that we are using in our computers or mobile phones. And if you ask me what an OS is, I can simply say that OS connects human interactions with the hardware. And in the computer world, we have three main OSs. First one would be Linux, and the second one would be Windows, and the third one would be the Mac OS, out of which Linux is the only free one. And to use Mac and Windows, we should be paying them. We might have come across many programmers in our life, but many kernel programmers, because there exist only a few kernel programmers, because kernel programming involves C language, which is quite difficult. So we cannot find many kernel programmers around the world. There are only a few, and the kernel of Linux was founded by a common man who could not afford Windows or Mac OS back in the 1990s. So he decided to create a OS which is free for all. So he created the kernel of Linux, and a complete OS of Linux was developed. Until date, we have thousands of Linux OSs which are used in different industries, and they all are open source coding, so anybody can code a Linux OS and can publish it. So there exist a lot of Linux OSs, out of which we have some famous ones like the Ubuntu or Mint Linux. We should have heard that Linux is mainly used by hackers. The OS of Linux used by hackers is called as a Kali Linux, and the commercial version of Linux OS is known as a Red Hat Linux, which if you are wondering what a server is, I can explain you with a simple example. Let's take YouTube for example. YouTube has billions of videos, and each video have their own title, description, number of likes and number of dislikes, and number of comments, and the comments have replies and number of shares and number of downloads. Like that, we have many things in YouTube. So all of these things must be stored in a private server, that is a private network of computers, which must be safe. So they have a big electronic device called as a server, which is on power supply for all the time, which is on for all the time, and it collects and distributes all the data, which is as big as a table. And the whole data on YouTube may be stored in a couple of servers which run full time 365 days a year to keep YouTube working. So okay, let's get into the most interesting part of this video now. How is Linux advantageous over Mac OS or Windows? It's so simple that Linux is an open source coding. I can explain you simply. You cannot just create an app and release it on the App Store, because iOS apps are developed by only a certain people who are employed by the Apple company. But anybody in the world can develop a Linux OS and publish it freely, and anybody can use the OS for free, because Linux is an open source coding, and that means anyone in the world can make changes in an OS. You can see the coding directly. You can see the basic structure of the coding directly, but you cannot do those things in a Mac OS or Windows, because they are closed source coding. That means the apps can be modified, the software can be modified only by the officials of Microsoft and the Apple directly, but you cannot do those things in a Mac OS or Windows, because they are closed source coding. That means the apps can be modified, the software can be modified only by the officials of Microsoft and the Apple. The second advantage is that you don't need an antivirus program for the Linux OS, because the Linux OS cannot read the viruses read by Windows or Apple. So not many viruses. The second advantage is that you don't need an antivirus program for the Linux OS, because the Linux OS cannot read the viruses read by Windows or Apple. So not many viruses exist that can actually affect the Linux OS. So you don't need to worry about the antivirus or your privacy, because only a few malware can affect your computer. You could literally do anything on Linux. You could do either banking or hacking or photo editing or anything you could do on Linux, but there are certain disadvantages. The first one is that you don't get the support of your computer manufacturer if you're using Linux. And the second thing is that Linux appearance is so clumsy. It doesn't look good, but it performs so well. Linux is actually faster than Microsoft, as it doesn't have a lot of background apps running, whereas in Microsoft it has a lot of background apps running, which may slow down the performance. But if you're using Linux, you could background apps running, whereas in Microsoft it has a lot of background apps running, which may slow down the performance. But if you're using Linux, you could do better performance and you could get your work done faster. Okay, let's finally talk about creating your own Linux OS. If you want to create your own Linux OS, you get the kernel, you get the basic kernel for free, because it is open source coding. Anyone can get it for free. And if you develop a new Linux OS, you have to sell it for free. You cannot cost money for that, because Linux is a organization for a good cause, so anybody can have access to your new OS. I did forget to tell you that you could run both Windows and Linux OS on the same computer at the same time, so this is very advantageous. Okay guys, that's all for today's video, and I will meet you in another video tomorrow. Until then, bye from Anand, Karthik. Stay positive.